Hi, I'm Kyle Marsh, and today I'm going to talk about best practices for implementing single sign-on for mobile apps with the Microsoft Identity Platform. So, what are the challenges that we see out in the world today for mobile application implementations? For me, the real bottom line here is um, the, users want to have a great single sign-on experience across all of their devices, but more and more these experiences need to happen on mobile devices. People obviously in these times especially are using all kinds of different devices in different places and different configurations, and customers want to see a great single sign-on experience as well across all of these devices. On the flip side, for developers, of course, implementing single sign-on across a wide range of implementations can be challenging. They need to understand what do they need to do to their applications to really support single sign-on. It may not have always been a top item on their list in the past. And how, in fact, do I do this in a way so that I can keep my customers happy, get them the security they need and want, as well as start to address some of their higher level questions about securing devices, securing their applications, making sure that their enterprise is safe, even regardless of the type of the device user is using and where. So these are all challenges of how you actually implement the kind of security and safety that our customers are asking for, especially on their mobile devices today. So let's start by defining, gives us some terms around single sign-on. First off, of course, what we really want to see is we want to see users having to enter their credentials as seldomly as possible. This is not just a great convenience. Most of the time, lots of users just don't want to be prompted for their credentials all the time. It's actually a matter of security as well. You know, passwords are some of our biggest problems out in the world today. They kind of have really run their road, and they're not really doing the work they need to do to protect users and the data and everything else. They are the source of over 99% of breaches we find in the enterprise today. So what we want to see is we want to see users entering their passwords, if they use passwords, less and less often. It should become more of an unusual event, because today, if I just go and type my username and password all throughout the day, time and time during the day, when someone sends me a phishing attack, I just type my username and password in because I'm now doing it without thinking. And that's a problem. So we really need to get single sign-on to help drive up the security in the enterprise. On top of that, of course, we need to move away from passwords and their like altogether. We need to be able to do things like MFA. Turning on MFA reduces your exposure to risk by 99%, over 99%, in fact. We need to move onto a much more sophisticated world with things like passwordless authentication and moving away from passwords altogether. On top of that, of course, just having even the user authenticate isn't really enough in many situations today. We need to know more about the conditions around these authentications. What device are they on? Where are they located on the internet, and so on? All of these things become issues for us as we move forward, right? So we need a more sophisticated model, not just of username and password and moving away from that, but also additional terms around the kinds of things that we need to do today to truly protect our users and their data. Now, as a developer, I look at the single sign-on at the mechanical level, if you will. What does it really mean to me as a developer to truly implement a single sign-on? Well, let's go back and look at some of the foundations of the way modern authentication works. So the first thing is an application doesn't try to do any of its own password management or try to figure out how to implement something like a password authentication, passwordless authentication, or FIDO2 key support. They simply delegate that work off to the identity provider, in this case, Microsoft Identity, and the application asks for a token from the identity provider. Now, by standards, what happens next is there is a private conversation that doesn't involve the developer of the application at all, but a private conversation between the user and the identity provider. Now, this conversation, also by standard, takes place on a web surface. So this is what allows the identity industry to go ahead and say, well, We don't need username and password because we're having this private conversation in our own UI, if you will, on the web surface. We can do whatever is required. We could ask for an MFA, we could go with a completely password experience. There's lots of options here as an identity provider to do the right thing with respect to truly authenticating the user, conditional access, etc. So these private conversations are really the key to the concept of having modern authentication. The other key that happens here is it's this private conversation between the user and the identity provider on a web surface that is the heart and soul of what we refer to as single sign-on today. The next time the user comes back from the same application and wants to do or needs to do an authentication, there are artifacts left in that original private conversation that make it so that the user doesn't have to go through the full authentication experience. Instead, we can rely on the artifacts, the cookies, the sessions, etc., that are in that private conversation and not have to say the user has to enter their password again or do another gesture. So it is this concept of a web surface having a status, a state with the identity provider that is the sign-in state, if you will. And if we can share that web surface, not just about the same app coming back to the same web surface, but now when another app comes in and uses that same web surface, now that state is shared and we have a single sign-on. The user is signed in once in the private conversation, another application comes in, uses the same private conversation, we have a single sign-on state. Now, the easiest model, of course, is the one that this was kind of originally developed for. We're all running in the same browser, so everything is automatically shared across the various applications because they're just tabs in a browser or new pages, what have you. But let's look at what has happened on mobile. Traditionally, mobile application developers have used these things called web views, embedded web views. In fact, in the early days of lots of mobile platforms, it was the only option for developers, as mobile platform providers really stressed the idea that every application was completely isolated from every other application and things weren't shared and so on. So I couldn't leak across applications, etc. So at the beginning of the process, a lot of developers got used to and frankly liked the fact that everything was within my application. So I control the user experience. I can control lots of elements about this web view. So it gives me a great control point as a developer. The user isn't going off somewhere else. They don't have a feeling of leaving my application, etc. So I use this embedded web view, and frankly, I can sign into an identity provider like Microsoft Identity, and every time the user goes to authenticate again, it still works. All of the artifacts are still there, and things work fine. The problem happens when we start having additional applications on the device. If each one of them goes ahead and implements an embedded web view model, now each one of the applications has its own separate session, its own separate state and artifacts between their embedded web views and the identity provider. There's no sharing across these embedded web views. So by choosing to go the sort of historical way of using, hey, I'm using an embedded web view in my application because it's great for my user experience and control, you're really opting in and saying, and I'm not going to participate in single sign-on. So every time the user, comes to my app fresh, I'll have to authenticate, even if they just a moment ago authenticated with the same credentials to the same identity provider in a different app. Now I have to do it in my app as well. So it's led to a lot of unhappiness with users. They don't want to have to enter their passwords again. As we talked before, it actually leads to some security issues as well. So what are our options here? Well, the first option that we approached is this idea of an authentication broker. Now, authentication brokers are effectively another process on the device that other applications can call to handle authentication. Now, the authentication brokers are a great concept because they can do not just say, well, I'm going to handle the web view from my authentication broker. So that state gets saved, if you are shared through this broker, but I can do additional things in the broker itself. So for example, our brokers use something called a primary refresh token that allows us to share additional information across all of these applications. So the authentication broker model is a good start. And this model we have today that I'm just showing is where we started with our authentication brokers on iOS and Android today, where applications call to the broker, and then the broker handles effectively the sharing point of these authentications. So each of these applications now completely benefits from single sign-on. They also have the additional benefit of benefiting from other capabilities that the broker may be able to do with respect to sharing device state, MFA state, and so on across all of these sessions as well. So it is a very optimal model for sharing and sophistication with respect to driving these authentications. However, it does have a couple of issues. One of the things is that everyone must adopt this broker approach. And obviously, we make that very easy with our libraries, but not all applications can use a library per authentication provider, for example. So we need to move to a model, and at Microsoft, we are doing this today. We're in the process of moving to a slightly more sophisticated model, where instead of the application broker using an embedded web view to drive authentication, we're going to start using what's referred to as the system browser instead. The mobile the mobile platforms have all started to create affordances so that we can drive effectively a shared authentication experience through what we refer to as a system browser. This means that now the web surface that we're using for authentication can be shared across multiple applications. So this gives us the ultimate in flexibility. Applications that need more sophistication or have already been developed or simply can use the authentication broker approach and benefit from all of the additional sophistication we can do because we have an entire process dedicated to making authentication smooth and reliable and resilient, etc. So any application can still do that. And at the same time, the authentication broker will also share the web surface by using the shared system browser so that other applications that have not adopted, for example, the authentication broker model, by using a shared system browser can also benefit from the single sign-on state. So application developers would now have a choice of going with directly to an authentication broker or directly to a system browser in order to drive these authentications. And that's the world that we would like to see everyone adopt. So we're doing work ourselves to make our authentication brokers start to use the system browser. And our asks to developers today is either move to an authentication broker, depending upon your application's needs, or to move at least to the system browser so that all of the applications on that device share the web surface we use to do the sign-ins. And then we end up with a really great single sign-in experience for our mutual users. So how could you go about using the system browser? Well, one option, and those of you who are targeting using the Microsoft Identity Platform directly, we do have our Microsoft authentication libraries. We have them for Android, we have them for iOS, we have them even for things like Xamarin that allow you to really take the optimal path here. Yes, our Microsoft authentication libraries will first look for a broker. If they find the broker, they'll go ahead and use the broker. So this can fully support things like all the richness of our conditional access, as well as enabling more sophisticated types of uses with things like Intune application protection policies that we'll talk a little bit about more later. But this makes this a very easy model for an application developer to do. And then we'll look after handling if the broker's there. If the broker's not there, we'll go back and automatically go to the system browser. So we'll handle all of that work for you, and we'll make it very easy for your application to adopt not just the single sign-on, but ability to adopt the broker as well. Now, of course, we do realize that not all developers, not all ISVs are open to saying, well, I'm going to optimize just for the Microsoft Identity Platform or maybe Intune, and I'd like to have an alternate approach. Well, the alternate approach is to use the system browser. The nice thing about the mobile platforms, all of the mobile platforms today, they have extended the capabilities from everyone must use their own embedded web view to do web browsing to the concept of creating a shared system browser-based experience specifically often to drive the shared authentication experience. So on iOS and Android, both of these platforms have created these affordances. We've got some links to their capabilities today that allow you to use the system browser. If you use the system browser, we can support obviously a single sign-on, so users don't have to go through their authentication credentials more than once on the device. Secondly, we can at least support the concept of, is this device managed? So for your customers who have rolled out a fully managed device and they are going ahead and managing the device fully from something like Intune, we can detect that the device is fully managed and still support at least that level of conditional access policies. So those are our primary options that we see. What we would like to do, what we really need the industry to do, including ourselves and the work we're doing today, is to move to the concept of using these system browsers. Now, I will mention one other thing. If you do use MSOL, one of the things a lot of companies are asking for today is more sophistication than we even provide with things like our conditional access policies. While MSOL can fully support conditional access policies, bringing in something like app protection policies with Microsoft Intune allow the enterprises, the customers, to have a more fine-grained control over how the apps work, especially as I start looking at things like a bring your own device scenario where companies let users, use their own iPhones or their own phones or tablets. This lets the company say, well, it's okay, you can use this application, but I need this application to work with these particular boundaries around it. So so for example, maybe a PIN is required. Maybe I want to make sure that this application doesn't try to share data with another application on the device. Maybe I want to make sure that the user doesn't even mistakenly take some company information and put it somewhere that's not protected as its personal area on the device. So companies want more control over how their applications run, even on these personal devices, and something like Intune app protection policies really enable that. And for you to take advantage of that capability and build for that in your applications, you do need to use our MSOL library, which obviously understands how to talk to the broker, gets our most sophisticated way of handling a shared authentication scheme across applications. And then from there, your application, the Intune SDK will work with that MSOL that you've implemented to drive the rest of the app protection policies to that device. So it's a great way for developers to allow their customers more control over how these applications work with their users' personal devices by combining the Intune SDK with an MSOL implementation. So a quick survey of what we do provide in our Microsoft Identity for Developer platform. The first thing, of course, applications need to state their intent to use Microsoft Identity for their authentication authorization needs. So we have an app registration experience both in APIs and our portal. The libraries and endpoints, the endpoint is what your application is going to call. That's our address on the internet. We have fully OpenID Connect certified endpoints for application developers to use. We do provide our MSOL libraries, which we talked about a moment ago. We do that not just for mobile, but for a number of different environments. And that's the easiest way to use Microsoft Identity for lots of developers, especially line of business developers who are targeting using our platform. And this, of course, gives you access to a wide range of web APIs. Chief among these are things like Azure APIs, but also Microsoft Graph, which allows, first off, you use to talk to the rest of our directory, but you can also use to talk of all of the productivity data that drives a customer's investment in Microsoft 365. We support a number of different identity types, from our traditional user with a corporate identity with Azure AD, a work and school account, to our users who have Microsoft personal accounts, say Outlook.com or Skype.com or even Xbox.com. So users who are not affiliated with a company but still might be interested in using their software. And then finally, we have our Azure AD B2C implementation that allows your specific solution to have a directory and then drive that directory, those authentications with lots of different identity providers, social media providers, and so on, to expand the reach of your particular solution. And finally, of course, all of this is built on industry standards. So If we don't have, for example, a Microsoft authentication library for your system, or you want to do everything at a different level, we implement fully things like OAuth 2, OpenID Connect protocols that allow you as an application developer to use and build on the Microsoft identity platform regardless of your technology.